This is Audible.
Omnilingual by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 1. Martha Dane paused, looking up at the purple-tinged copper sky, and the dust storm that was sweeping the high deserts to the east by the haze was a gorgeous magenta ball, as large as 50,000 years. The red loess lay over the plaza, hiding the small houses that had been crushed and pressed flat under it, and the rubble that had come down from the tall building. Here where she stood, the ancient streets were 100 in the wall of the building behind her had opened into the sixth, coated with red dust. She thought again of what clearing this city would mean, in terms of time and labor, of people and supplies and equipment brought across 50 million miles of space. They'd have to use machinery. There was no other way it could be done. And the careful, patient native laborers, the painstaking foremen, the pickmen and spademen, the long files of basketmen carrying away the earth. Slow and prim, but she could count on the fingers of one hand the times one of her pickmen had damaged a valuable object in the ground. If archaeology would still be back where Wickleman had found it, left, a solenoid jackhammer, Tony Latimer redistributing it, shifting the straps of her oxy-tank tools from the other, gathering the notebooks and sketchbooks under of buried rubble around snags of wall jutting up out to the huts. There were 10 people in the main office of Hut 1 when she entered. As soon as she had disposed of her oxygen equipment, sitting at the end of the long table against the farther wall, smoking his big curved pipe and going through a loose-leaf notebook, a couple of girl lieutenants from Signals going over the script of the evening television. He was a civilian. He was advertising the fact with a white shirt, water to wash her hands and sponge off her face, that they were doing something about the pipeline. She started to carry the note snowflake. She grasped it with tweezers, placed it on the sheet. It was a sheer joy to watch her. Every movement was as cocktail time yet, is it? The girl at the table spoke without raising her head, almost without moving her lips, as though she did it. There could be a faintly critical overtone to that. As she replied, Martha realized that she was being defensive. It will, some day. Look how long it took to read Egyptian hieroglyphics, even after they had the Rosetta Stone. Sachiko smiled. Yes, I know. There is no Rosetta Stone, not anywhere in Mars. A whole race, a whole species, died while the first Cro-Magnon cave artist was daubing pictures of reindeer and bison. Give us the meaning of a few words, and we'll use them to pry. So, Martha, really I do. It would be wonderful for you to be the first to do it, and it would be wonderful for all of us to be able to read what these people wrote. It would really be. You haven't found any more pictures? Sachiko shook her head over the book. Selim von Olm looked up quickly, as though making a mental note to attend to something. There wasn't much to do at that, he agreed. Do you know which building Tony has decided to enter next? The tall one, with a conical thing like a candle extinguisher on top, I think. The last one hadn't. It had been stripped of its contents and fittings, a piece of this and a bit of that, haphazardly. There was nothing left but the foundation traces. That's where we are fortunate. This is one of the places where... And if we learn to read their language, we'll learn the whole story, not just the obituary. She hesitated to get some more work done on my lists before dinner. For an instant, Ash had been enough, however. She knew what he was thinking. She sent photostats of restored pages of books, and transcripts of inscriptions were piled in front of her, and the notebooks in which cigarette, and reached over to a stack of unexamined material, taking off the top sheet. It was a photostat of what looked like the long vertical symbols were vowels. There were only 10 of them. That sounds like NG or CH or SH were single words, and she couldn't assign a meaning to one of them. Selim von Olmhorst believed that she never would, reticent about saying so. So she was sure did Sachiko in front of her, began squirming and dancing. Slender vowels, all 3 were listed. In addition, Mastar was just pasted a couple of existing words together. It was a smaller line under the title was plainly the issue number and 754th issue for Dama, forcefully on her cigarette as she leafed through notebooks and piles of already examined material. Sachiko was speaking to somebody in a chair with a single star of a major on his shoulder, sitting down. Ivan Fitzgerald, the medic. He was lifting weights from a book similar to the one the girl ordnance officer was restoring. "Haven't had time lately," he was saying, in reply to Sachiko's question. "Dissecting specimens for Bill Chandler. Bill's finally found a man," Sachiko was asking. "Seems to be close to the ground." Fitzgerald got the headband of his loupe adjusted and pulled it down over his head inaudibly to himself, lifting the page a little at a time and sliding one of the transparent plastic sheets under it, working with the plastic sheet onto it. "Any pictures?" she asked. Page, then picked up his pipe and relighted it. "Is ever going to get anything out of this?" Sachiko held up a scrap of the silicone plastic the Martians had used for paper with her tweezers. It was almost an inch square. "Look, took the easy book." Fitzgerald wasn't being sidetracked. "This stuff's absolutely meaningless," he continued. "It had a meaning 50,000 years ago when it was written, but it has none at all now." She shook her head. "Like a pretty pointless distinction." Selim von Olmhurst joined the conversation. "There no longer exists a means of deciphering it." "We'll find one." She was speaking, she realized, more in self-encouragement than in controversy. "How? The second in exile at dawn." "Plus, if we found something like that," von Olmhurst began. Hubert Penrose's voice broke in from directly behind the geologist's table. Captain Field and the Airdyne pilot had gone out, and at the head of each list was a little picture, learning each other's specialties on this expedition. "I heard about that long before this expedition was even contemplated, when I was a lieutenant, as a feat of cryptanalysis in 1963, because only with a rescue have we of finding anything like that here." "Yes, I think I have one." She was trying. She picked up the photostat and handed it along the table to him. He was silent for a moment, looking at it. "Yes, I was working on the first page of the first article listed here. Wait. Surprising that a thing like a magazine would have survived so long." "Well, this silicone stuff the Martians used for paper has pretty survived. We have found a good many books and papers in this civilization had been dying for hundreds of years before the end completely that such activities as publishing ended." Mas Tarnovad Tadavas Sonhulva. After examining the title page and some of the inside pages, he began whispering into the stenophone he had taken from his belt. "A start, isn't it?" Penrose argued. "Grotefend only had..." "That's not the story," Chamberlain said. "What the public's," and peeling out of their quilted coveralls. Two were Space Latimer and his helpers. "Don't tell me Martha finally..." Hubert Penrose went on to explain, showing the photostat. Tony Latimer looked at it, glanced at it, and dropped it on the table. "Sounds plausible, of course, but just an assumption. That word..." He dismissed the subject and turned to Penrose. "I put in a crushed. Ground level's higher than the other one, about the 7th floor. Volunteers," Penrose told him. "What will you need in the way of equipment?" "Oh, about 6 demolition packets. They can all be time without a qualified archaeologist along. 3 parties if did some work, and I helped out a little, but 9/10 of it she did herself." "Purely arbitrary," Latimer disdained. "Why, we don't even know that the Martians could make the same kind of busts and pictures I've seen. I'd say that their vocal organs were identical with our own." "Well, grant that. And grant that it's going to be impressive to rattle off the names of Martian notables whose statues we found, and that, if we're ever able to attribute any place names, they'll sound a lot better than the this stuff, of which nobody will ever be able to read a word if she fiddles around so many words." She was glad Latimer had said it, and not Selim von Olmhurst. "What you mean," she retorted, I don't object to your gambling your professional reputation and making a laugh one archaeologist discredit the whole subject in the eyes of the public. She was framing a reply when the communication outlet whistled. Chapter 2. The library, which was also lounge, recreation room, and general gathering place, was already crowded. Most of the crowd was at the long table topped with sheets of then drifted into reminiscences of their work on Terra. On standing and reputation, it's against all archaeological the Harappa hieroglyphics. No such continuity exists. Colonel Penrose say once that an officer who's afraid to risk his... It's the same with us. If we really want to find things out, across the room to where Tony Latimer was sitting with Gloria Standish, teenies, and listened. Gloria was the leading contender for the bosomy blondes, but Tony would have been just as attentive to her if she had looked like the Wicked Witch in The Wizard of Oz, because of the expedition. "I know you are," the old Turco-German was saying. "That's why, when they asked me to pushed onto the expedition by his university, there'd been a lot of insistence that the Martian language can be translated." She shrugged and drank some more of her cocktail, then lit another cigarette. He only felt. "Neither do I, now, but I will. Maybe I'll find something like the picture books Sachiko was a few years. And when the Schiaparelli orbits in, this is a whole new world of archaeology, literally. Yes." He finished the cocktail and looked at his pipe, as though wondering whether to relight it so soon before dinner, then put it in his pocket. "A whole new world. But I've grown old, and it isn't for me. I've spent my life studying. Dr. Wallace wouldn't be able to understand my modern Turkish accent, but the things I've had to learn here, chemistry, physics, engineering, and was just learning how to work iron. Mars is for young people. This expedition is a cod started now. You and Tony and whoever comes out on, you have a whole new world. This is only one city, the late upland culture and the canal builders, and all the civilizations and races and empires before them, clear back to the Martian Stone Age." He hesitated for a moment. Isn't the time to start specializing too narrowly." They all got out of the truck and stretched their legs and looked up. The four little figures that had been busy against its wall. Sachiko attached the free end of the cable to a nuclear electric battery. At once, dirty gray smoke and orange dust puffed and banged. She and Tony Latimer and Major Lindemann climbed onto the truck, leaving the jeep stand by the road, and lay unbroken on the ground. Martha remembered the first bit they need to do. It had bounced back. He had drawn his pistol, they'd all carried guns then, on the principle that what they didn't know about Mars might easily hurt them, and fired 4 shots, something that looked like a surrealist machine gun, but which was really a nuclear-electric jackhammer. Martha selected dig or chop or poke or pry, or help herself over rough footing. The windows, grimed and crusted with 50 millennium floor. Somebody snapped on a floodlight, aiming it at the... "This one's been stripped up to the 7th floor, Latimer exclaimed. "Street level be cleaned out completely. Due for pried loose." The door, one of the double sliding things the Martians had used, was closed. Selim von Ulm hip and squeezed the trigger latch. The hammer banged briefly, then stuck. Enough dust had worked into the recess to force a door, and they were prepared for it. Somebody went outside and brought in a power jack, and finally one of the doors inched back to electronic devices, all where the class could face them, audio-visual teaching aids. A 25-story university, this would handle 30,000 students. Maybe when they changed classes, it'd take half an hour to get everybody back and horsed. "I'm going up above this floor. This place has been looted clean up to here, but there's a chance there may be something above," German replied. "There will be much coming and going," and quoted first. "Then Major Lindemann's people can do their work. Value. We'll turn them into living quarters. I like this building." Most of the open rooms were empty, but a few contained furniture involved in cleaning them. But they were still distinguishable, deer. peasants sowing and reaping, priests and warriors, battles with swords and bows and with cannon and visible means of propulsion and aircraft, changing costumes and weapons and machines and styles of architecture, cities, an abandoned city with 4 tiny humanoid, they and their vehicle dwarfed by the huge, lifeless foe. Von Olmhurst was saying, "The entire history of authenticity in the Darfulva History Department. Zine was a journal of Sonhulva." Penrose extended to realize that he had called her by her first name and not Dr. to our ology, and Darf would mean something like path gives you 3 words, Martha. Sachiko jubilated. You does it and tells us which subject is meant. But as for a side of the Martian's thought, scientifically or otherwise. He stopped short, startled by the blue-white light that blazed. As stopped, it was Chamberlain who was speaking. "This is the biggest all on 4 walls. I'm taking this with the fast shutter interpretation of each scene as it's shown. Would you do that?" Would he do that? Martha thought. If he had a tail, it'd be wagging. Sachiko did. Immediately, Ivan Fitzgerald volunteered. Sid decided to go upstairs with Tony Latimer and Gloria. Chapter 3. The 6th floor was Darfulva, too. Military and technological history from the character of the murals. They looked around the central hall and went down to the 5th. It was like the floors above, except that the big quadrangle was stacked with dusty furniture and boxes. Ivan Fitzgerald, who was carrying the test tube, or some bit of scientific apparatus, and behind them were scenes of laboratories and factories, flame and smoke, was one with which she was already familiar. Sonhulva did the paintings. Chemistry or physics? Both. The scraggly whiskers must be the inventor of the spectroscope. He has in the blue smock beside him, worked in organic chemistry. Subject. Sonhulva? Sachiko suggested. If Hulv is something like science, Son must mean Martha. A civilization like this would certainly leave something like this that would be self-explanatory. This old shot, you can't bear the possibility of anybody else being a bigger big shot, and whoever makes a start on reading this language will be the biggest big shot archaeology ever saw. Mezzanine around a wide central hall on the street level, the floor 40 feet below them, and the ceiling 30 feet above. A huge group of sculptured figures in the middle. Some kind of a mowed their way down and walked among the clutter, missing 100 things. The boxes were plastic. Nobody had outwardly intact. The powdery heaps might have been any tool Sachiko carried on her belt. They pounded and pried and leathery chunks of meat. Sachiko and Penrose, poking into it, found the switch's source, whatever that had been, had failed. The middle basement had also been used, at least toward the end. Case on case of books, half an acre of cases, 15 feet to the ceiling. Fitzgerald and Penrose, who had pushed in behind her, were talking in rapid excitement. She only heard the sound of their voices, not their words. This must be the main stacks of the university library, the entire literature of the vanished race of Mars. In the talking about the spidery metal stairs. I'd say they were safe. It seemed to have been converted into a sort of common living room apparatus and a metal fractioning tower that extended through a hole knocked in the ceiling 70 feet above. A good deal of plastic furniture of the sort they had been finding everywhere in the city, along a number of lines, must have been carried on here for framed glass cases. There had been administrative offices there, too. The doors of most of them were closed, and they did not waste time trying to force them. But those that were open had been turned into living quarters. They made notes and rough floor plans to guide them in future more thorough examination, examining them and collecting them for removal. He had the floor checkerboarded with a grid of chalked lines, each numbered. We have 3 gangs, all the floodlights I have, sketching and furniture and broken trash and scraps of paper. Did you find anything down on the lower floors? Well, yes, Penrose said, a hint of mirth. They had electric power to the last. We found refrigerators full of food and stoves with the dinner still on them. They must have used the Dark Ages in Europe, or what such a monastery would have been like after the rest of the planet had gone back to barbarism. I suppose. You're not going to insist on making this building into expedition quarters, I hope, Colonel? Von Olmhurst asked anxiously. Oh, no. This place is an archaeological. We can use temporary air sealing floor by floor and portable equipment. When we have things atmosphered and lighted and heated, Tony Latimer and his companions came down to the 7th floor a little later. I don't get all this. What sort of condition are the generators in? Penrose asked. Well, everything's full of dust that blew in under the rotor, of course. Power, so they use the elevators to haul stuff down. Chapter 4. Lunch at the huts was a hasty meal, with a gabble of full-mouthed and excited talking. Hubert Penrose and his chief subordinates snatched their food in a huddled consultation at one end of the table. In the afternoon, work was expedition concentrated their efforts on the university. By the middle of the afternoon, the 7th floor had been completely examined, covered with protective tarpaulins, and Laurent Geikel and his ventilation ducts and plugged them. An elevator shaft on the north would take care of the floors below. Nobody seemed willing to try before a couple of cars and the necessary machinery could be fabricated. She took off her own helmet speaker, throat mic, and mask. Respondents, Sid Chamberlain and Gloria Standish, moved in that evening bar and lunch counter. For a few days the place was full of noise and activity. Then, gradually, the Space Force people. There was still the business of air sealing the more habitable of the buildings, or and a half, of the 500 members of the main expedition. To be capable of maintenance work, and had prepared against it. The actual work there was being done by Salim, Tony Latimer, metal and plastic, if there were no other way. Wherever they looked, and the hacksaw beside it, pots and pans with hardened remaining materials on desks, as though the writer had gotten up, meaning to round her, watching disapprovingly every time she picked up something, happy to escape the crowding and lack of privacy of the huts. She was afraid some rust may have gotten into it. The others felt it. What happened to them? Where did they go? You didn't expect them to be waiting out front with a red carpet and a big band? No, of course not. They've all been dead for 50,000 years. But if they were the last of the Martians, why haven't we found their... He looked at the glass, a bubble-thin goblet, found with hundreds of... How did they get out? And why did they leave? It'll start as soon as you shove a switch in. You didn't notice that there are a lot of interesting things in advance of what we're using now, but it looked like originally. Did it look as though anybody made any attempt to fix it? Martha asked. Sachiko shook her head. They must have taken one look at it and given up. I don't needed electricity for lighting and heating, and all their industrial equipment was electrical. They had a good life here with power. Without it, this place wouldn't have been habitable. Then why slid down a rope from upstairs? Von Olmhurst suggested. This Houdini trick doesn't worry me too much. We'll find out eventually. Yes, about the time Martha starts reading Martian, Latimer scoffed. That may be just when we'll find out, Von Olmhurst replied seriously. Salim, Latimer demanded. I know it would be a wonderful, only because they're possible, and this isn't. Let me quote, nothing can be translated out of nothing, or that later but not less distinguished hittologist, Salim von Olmhurst. Where are you going to get your bilingual? Friedrich coffee powder into his cup and added hot water. Martha, you have been working for years in the Indus Valley. How many words of Harappa have you or anybody else ever been able to read? We never found a university with a 500,000-volume library, and on the first day we entered this building, we established meanings for several words, Salim von Olmhurst added. Not specific meaning of word elements, and you have a dozen different... will, anyhow. You mean you've changed? You mean you're going to throw away everything you've accomplished and talked me into anything, von Olmhurst said roughly. And I don't know what the devil you're talking about. Everything I know about the Hittite Empire is published and available to anybody. Hittite grave robber and junk picker. And there's more pick and shovel work, and go back to scribbling footnotes about Hittite kings. And Martianology, too. You can't leave that for anybody else. He realized, as Martha did, what he had betrayed. She sat avoiding the eyes of the others, looking at the ceiling of them. Tony Latimer had, desperately, wanted a new field. If Selim entered it, he would bring with him the reputed big shot. His derision of her own efforts became comprehensible, too. It wasn't that he was convinced that she would. Ivan Fitzgerald finally isolated and submitted. They found a globe of Mars, made when the city had been a seaport. They located the city and learned that its name had been Kukan, or something with a similar vowel-consonant ratio. Began giving their telecasts a Kukan dateline, and Hubert Penrose used the name in his official reports. 10 more or less equal months, and one of them had been Doma. Another month was Nor, and that was a part of the name of the scientific journal Martha had found. Bill traced it was a something with wings, and what were almost but not quite feathers, though it was more reptilian than avian in general characteristics. He and Ivan Fitzgerald skinned and mounted it. About 7/8 of its body capacity was lungs. It fought human life, or 5 times as much as the air around Kukan. That took the center of interest away from archaeology. Craft, 4 jetacopters and 3 wingless airdyne reconnaissance fighters were thrown into intensified exploration of the lower. The university was left to Selim and Martha and Tony Latimer, the latter keeping to himself while she and the old Turco-German worked together. The civilian specialists in other fields and the 5 species of what might loosely be called birds, and something a mural, and another, like a gazelle, with a single host from Terra, showed a corresponding shift in interest at home, a home for humanity. It was Tony Latimer who brought archaeology floor, scrubbing the grime from the glass cases, noting content, who came hurrying in from the mezzanine, almost bursting with excitement. Little room, back of one of the old faculty offices. Chandler's found a 3-headed hippopotamus. Sid, don't you get it? We've found the Martians. She slammed the phone. Chapter 5. Martha remembered the closed door in the first survey. They hadn't attempted opening it. Now it was burned away at both sides and lay, still hot along the edges. The center of the room was filled by a long table. An armchair for the last 50 millennia. There were bottles and glasses on the finger. Skeletons covered with leather, glorious skulls, arms and legs like sticks, the flesh shrunken above them. Von Olmhorst had noticed them at a couple of hand forges in the shop on the first floor. That's why he ventilator and peered into it. Stuffed with rags. They must have been all that were left here. Their power was gone. We know what became of them now, anyhow. The Terran public wanted to hear about Martians, and if live Martians couldn't be found, a room full of dead ones was the next best thing. Tony Latimer, the discoverer, was beginning to cash in on his attention after listening to the telecast from Terra 2 days after his decision. Can you remember when Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter? I was 2 years old then, von Olmhorst chuckled. I really don't know how much that publicity ever did for excavations, but I don't know how much good all this I think one of us should go back on the Cyrano when the Schiaparelli orbits. I shall go back at least for a while and see what I can do. Lectures. The Organization of Society of Martian Archaeology, with Anthony Latimer, Ph.D., the logical candidate for the chair. Titles and salaries. Sweet are the uses of publicity. She crushed out her cigarette and got to her feet. Well, on Sonnhova tomorrow, and I want that stuff in shape for the infantry do the slogging through the mud, the brass hats, what she was doing. She told him, I wonder if you could... Yes, I'm a pretty fair doorbuster myself. He looked around, carrying his tray over to the dishwasher. Oh, Sid, you doing anything for the... Chamberlain shrugged. Why not? A jammed door can have... Jeff Miles, the Space Force captain, came over. accompanied by one of the lab crew from the ship who had come down in the rocket the day before. Chemistry and physics department. Want to come along? A cigarette, and they went out into the hall together. Gathered equipment, help. It was no problem, and in 10 minutes they had it open wide enough to the door facing a low platform, but their seats and the lecturer's table and equipment had been removed. The two side walls bore inscriptions. On the right, a pattern of concentric circles. Tranter was pointing at the diagram on the right. Well, not quite. They knew about electron shells, but they have the nucleus pictured as a solid mass. No indication of the uranium atom, Captain Miles mentioned. It is? Sid was saying. Not Sid. We knew about uranium a long time. There was something familiar about the table on the left wall, about physics, and what she had picked up by accident afterward. Element came next, but in Martian it was Sarfoldavas. The others, catching hold of Hubert Penrose's arm with one hand and waving her clipboard with the other. Look at this thing over there, she was clamoring excitedly. Tell me what you think it is. Could it be a knew what those squiggles meant? That was right. He had spent his time. That help? She asked, beginning to set down the Arabic digits, same as we use. Sure, if that's a table of elements, and gave it to him. Penrose knew the numbers and was ahead of him, reading off the names of the elements. I know hydrogen and helium. What's Terfoldavas, the third one? Lithium decimal point. Hydrogen's 1 plus if that double hook. The little loop is the handle, and the long pointed loop is the blade. Atomic weight given as 9 and a hook. Actually, it's 9. Third element, lithium, is period 2, group 1. That check? The second month. What's the first element in period 3? Trav. Why, the names of the months are sludge. Meteorology. In other words, I wonder what Mast Harnovad means. It surprised her that after so long, and with so much happening in the meantime, he could remember that. Something like journal or review for a specific month, the 5th one. And if the animals and the dead Martians, wait till Salim and Tony see this. Wait till old Tara's going to go nuts about it. He turned to Captain Miles. Telecast. This is just a beginning. It'll take years, and people there will work on it. We'll send them everything we can, everything we work out, and copies of books and copies of your word lists. And there would be other tables, astronomical tables, tables in physics and mechanics, for instance. In Willow would be full of them. Transliterate them into Roman alphabet spellings and Arabic numerals, and somewhere somebody would spot each numerical significance as Hubert Penrose and Mort Tranter and she had done with the table of elements, and this would take on meaning from contexts in which the names of elements appears. Found out how to read Martian. He grabbed Captain Miles, who was still babbling, as he hurried from the room. Sachi looked at the inscription. Is it true? She asked, and then before, oh, it really is. You're reading it. Oh, I'm so happy. How do you know that their table of elements was anything like a chemistry student could tell you what elements they represented? Penrose said. The old man shook his head, slowly, smiling. I'm afraid I realize that. One of the things I'm going to place an order for, physics of the sort intended for a bright child of 10 or 12. He could have it that way. His friendship would mean as little to her as his derision, except that his friends had to watch their backs. You can be sure Dr. Dane will be given full credit. Confess my own share. You said we had to find a better than a bilingual, Martha, Hubert Penrose said. Physiologists have dealt only with pre-scientific cultures. This concludes the read by Jim Roberts.